They laughed at it because it didn't look like a weapon. It didn't roar. It didn't fire. It didn't even move. It was a quiet box of circuits and cables bolted into an aircraft that was already considered obsolete by many of the pilots who flew it. And the question that echoed through the briefing room that morning wasn't subtle or polite. It was blunt, almost mocking. How is this thing supposed to help us survive when real combat starts? For decades, air combat had followed a brutal but familiar logic. Spot the enemy first. Turn faster. React quicker. Whoever saw first and pulled the trigger first usually lived. Pilots trusted their eyes, their instincts, and muscle memory drilled into them through endless hours of training. Radar existed, yes, but it was clumsy, slow, unreliable, and often useless in the chaos of a real dogfight. So when this new targeting system arrived, promising to do something radical, many saw it as an insult rather than an innovation. The system claimed it could track multiple aircraft at once, calculate trajectories in real time, and guide weapons without relying entirely on the pilot's visual confirmation. To experienced combat pilots, that sounded dangerous. Trusting a machine instead of your own eyes in the middle of a fight felt like surrendering control at the worst possible moment. They joked that it belonged in a laboratory, not over hostile skies. Some called it a toy. Others called it a liability, waiting to get someone killed. What made it worse was who approved it. Not the top ace, not the celebrated commanders. It came from a small group of engineers and operators who had never been in a dogfight themselves. Men who spoke in equations, probabilities, and signal processing instead of instinct and fear. The cultural gap between them and the pilots was enormous. In the world of air combat, reputation mattered, and this system had none. But war has a way of forcing decisions when pride and tradition no longer matter. On the day everything changed, the situation in the air was already bad. Enemy aircraft were probing defenses with confidence, exploiting predictable interception patterns, overwhelming pilots who relied on visual contact alone. Losses were mounting. Fatigue was everywhere, and suddenly the unthinkable happened. A formation was scrambled with the new system still installed, not because anyone believed in it, but because there was no time to remove it. That moment, that reluctant decision, is where the story truly begins. Inside the cockpit, the pilot did what he had always done. He scanned the sky, checked his instruments, listened to radio chatter, but now there was something else competing for his attention. A display feeding him information faster than his eyes could process. Blips appeared where nothing could yet be seen. Vectors updated constantly. The system wasn't asking for permission. It was already working. At first, it felt wrong, almost distracting. The pilot hesitated, questioning whether to trust what he was seeing on the display or what his instincts told him. Years of training screamed one thing. The machine suggested another. That internal conflict, that split second of doubt, nearly cost everything. Then the first target aligned. What no one in that briefing room had understood was that this system wasn't designed to replace the pilot. It was designed to compress time, to remove the delay between detection, decision, and action. In air combat, seconds are life. Fractions of seconds decide who fires first and who never gets the chance. As enemy aircraft closed in, moving faster than expected, the system began doing something no human could. It tracked multiple targets simultaneously, without bias, without panic, without tunnel vision. It didn't focus on the most obvious threat, It calculated the most dangerous one, then the next, then the next. After that, the pilot didn't fully realize what was happening yet. He was reacting, not understanding. His hands moved, guided by cues he hadn't trusted hours earlier. The sky outside still looked chaotic, but inside the cockpit, the picture was suddenly clear in a way it had never been before. And somewhere in that unfolding chaos, the first shot was fired. No one on the ground was watching the clock. No one was counting seconds. But what followed would later be measured with brutal precision. A single minute, 60 seconds. Enough time for most dogfights to barely begin. Enough time, as it turned out, to change everything. Before we go any further, pause for a second and think about what you just heard. A system that everyone laughed at. A technology dismissed as dangerous, unnecessary, even stupid. And yet, in the middle of real combat, it began to do something human reflexes alone could not. This is exactly why understanding how wars are actually what matters. Not the myths, not the polished stories, but the moments where decisions, hesitation, and innovation collide under pressure. If this kind of story makes you question what you thought you knew about air combat, technology, and survival, take a moment to leave a comment. Tell me what you think matters more in war: human instinct or machine precision. Your perspective helps keep this conversation alive and pushes these forgotten moments into the spotlight where they belong. And if you want to see how this single minute in the sky unraveled everything the enemy thought they understood, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It tells the algorithm that stories like this deserve to be shared, not buried. For the enemy pilots, nothing about that minute made sense. Every doctrine they relied on assumed a predictable sequence of events. Detection happened visually. Engagements unfolded, one target at a time. Even the most advanced formations were built around the idea that a human pilot could only truly focus on a single threat in a given instant. That assumption had shaped tactics, training, and confidence for years. And now, in the space of seconds, it was collapsing. The first aircraft went down before the others even realized they were under effective attack. There was no long chase, no dramatic turning jewel, no warning flare of tracers cutting through the sky. One moment, the formation was tightening, preparing to press its advantage. The next, one aircraft was simply gone. Smoke, debris, and silence where a pilot had been alive seconds earlier. That, Aluna, would have been shocking. But shock was only the beginning. As the remaining pilots tried to react, their instincts betrayed them. They did what training demanded. They broke formation, each pilot attempting to locate the threat visually, scanning the sky for a muzzle flash, a silhouette, any clue that could anchor the response. That reaction was logical. It was also exactly what the new targeting system had anticipated. The system did not see panic. It did not hesitate. It did not care that one aircraft was already falling. It recalculated, continuously adjusting firing solutions as targets scattered, predicting where each aircraft would be a fraction of a second into the future rather than where it was now. Human pilots react to what they see. Machines act on what will happen next. The second aircraft was hit during a maneuver that had saved pilots countless times before. A sharp brake combined with a vertical climb, a move designed to force overshoot and regain positional advantage. Against a human opponent, it often worked. Against a system already calculating velocity, angle, and closure rate, it became a liability. The aircraft climbed directly into a solution that had already been solved before the pilot even committed to the move. By the time the third aircraft was engaged, Confusion had turned into disbelief. Radio calls overlapped. Warnings contradicted each other. Pilots shouted bearings that were already obsolete by the time they were spoken. In high-speed air combat, spoken information is always late. The system did not rely on words. It relied on math. The third kill happened as the formation attempted to regroup. Pilots instinctively seek safety in numbers, believing that proximity offers protection and mutual support. That belief assumes the enemy must choose one target at a time, but the system had never been limited that way. It simply selected the highest probability engagement window and executed it without emotional hesitation. Now fear entered the equation. Not the controlled fear pilots trained to manage, but raw uncertainty, the realization that the sky itself had become unreliable, that what they were seeing could no longer be trusted to reflect the true danger around them. Fear changes decision-making. It narrows focus. It accelerates mistakes. The fourth aircraft fell as a direct result of that fear. A pilot attempting to disengage broke altitude too aggressively, exposing himself in a moment that would normally go unnoticed. The system did not miss it. In under 60 seconds, 4 aircraft were gone, not through brute force or superior numbers, but through an asymmetry of perception and time. On the ground, analysts would later struggle to explain what had happened. The timeline didn't match expectations. The kill sequence defied established engagement models. It looked almost impossible on paper, but in the air, in that moment, it had felt inevitable. What mattered most was not the number of aircraft destroyed, but what followed immediately after. The enemy pilots did not press the attack. They disengaged. They withdrew not because they were outgunned, but because they no longer understood the rules of the fight. Air combat depends on confidence as much as firepower. When confidence evaporates, dominance follows. This was the true power of the system, not just destruction, but disruption. It shattered the assumption that skill and experience alone guaranteed survival. It exposed a future where reaction speed mattered less than anticipation, where seeing first no longer meant winning first. What happened next was not an immediate celebration or recognition. There was no dramatic announcement, no urgent message declaring a breakthrough. In fact, for several minutes after the engagement ended, the silence was almost unsettling. Pilots returned to base, unsure of how to describe what they had just witnessed, and operators on the ground struggled to reconcile sensor data with long-held assumptions about air combat. The system itself did not record victory. It simply logged events, target acquired, solution calculated, engagement executed, repeated 4 times. To the engineers who had designed it, the data made sense. To the commanders reviewing after-action reports, it felt uncomfortable. Victories that could not be explained were dangerous. They disrupted hierarchy, doctrine, and authority. Inside the debriefing room, skepticism returned quickly. Some officers suggested the kills were coincidence. Others argued the enemy pilots must have made catastrophic errors. A few hinted that the success was exaggerated by adrenaline and chaos. The idea that a machine had meaningfully altered the outcome of an air engagement was still hard to accept, even with wreckage on the ground and confirmed losses on the enemy side. But then something subtle began to emerge. The pilots who had relied on the system started noticing patterns. Engagements felt different. Threats appeared earlier. Decision windows felt wider, not because the aircraft was faster, but because uncertainty was reduced. The system was not removing danger. It was removing surprise. And in warfare, Surprise is often deadlier than firepower. At the same time, enemy behavior began to shift. Reconnaissance reports showed altered flight paths. Intercept patterns became less aggressive, more cautious. Pilots who had previously pressed attacks with confidence now hesitated, breaking off earlier than expected. They had not been briefed on a new weapon. They had only experienced something that violated their internal model of reality. That violation mattered. Military tactics rely on predictability, not just of one's own forces, but of the enemy's reactions. When those reactions change without explanation, planning becomes guesswork. The targeting system didn't just shoot down aircraft. It introduced doubt, and doubt spreads faster than fear. Attempts were made to replicate the success immediately. Other units requested access to the system. Some installed it hastily, without full integration or training. The results were mixed. In some cases, it worked. In others, it caused overload, distraction, even near-miss incidents. Critics seized on those failures as proof that the original success had been a fluke. What they missed was a critical detail. The system was never meant to be dropped into existing doctrine unchanged. It required a shift in mindset. Pilots had to learn when to trust it and when to override it. Operators had to understand that it was a partner, not an autopilot. Without that adaptation, the technology could not reach its full potential. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, intelligence analysts began asking uncomfortable questions. If this system could collapse enemy formations so quickly, what would happen once the enemy realized what they were facing? Would they adapt? Could they counter it? Or would this advantage remain asymmetric long enough to reshape the air war entirely? Those questions had no immediate answers. But one thing was becoming clear. The minute when 4 aircraft fell was not an isolated incident. It was a signal, a warning that the balance between human intuition and machine calculation had shifted, even if no one was ready to admit it publicly. And for the small group of people who had believed in the system from the beginning, the realization was both satisfying and terrifying. They hadn't just proven the system worked. They had proven that future battles might be decided before pilots even realized they were fighting. The enemy did not understand what had hit them, but they understood something far more dangerous. Their old rules no longer worked. For years, their air tactics had been built on repetition and confidence. They trusted formations, angles, timing windows that had been refined through countless engagements. Those patterns had kept pilots alive. They had also made them predictable. And predictability is a vulnerability. What unfolded after those 4 aircraft were destroyed was not immediate retaliation, but hesitation. Enemy pilots began second-guessing maneuvers that once felt automatic. Turns were delayed. Attacks were aborted halfway through execution. Formations loosened instead of tightening. Every pilot was now watching not just the sky, but their instruments, their wingmen, and their own instincts with suspicion. That hesitation created gaps. The targeting system had not forced the enemy into chaos by overwhelming force. It had done something more subtle. It had broken their internal clock. In air combat, timing is everything. Pilots rely on expected reaction times, expected delays between movement and response. When those expectations collapse, decisions come too early or too late. Both are fatal. Enemy after-action reports would later describe engagements that felt unnatural. Pilots reported being tracked before they believed they were visible. Others described feeling exposed even when executing textbook maneuvers. One pilot wrote that it felt like the aircraft opposing him was already waiting for his move. That single sentence revealed everything. The enemy was no longer reacting. They were being anticipated. Attempts to adapt only deepened the problem. Some enemy units tried to tighten formations, believing mutual coverage would overwhelm any single targeting solution. Instead, they presented denser clusters of targets, making prioritization easier. Others attempted aggressive, evasive maneuvers immediately upon detection, burning energy too early and leaving themselves vulnerable moments later. A few pilots reverted to extreme caution, disengaging before committing fully, surrendering airspace without a fight. Each response was logical. Each response played directly into the system's strength. The targeting system thrived on patterns, not chaos, but chaos born from fear is still a pattern. Abrupt climbs, overcorrected dives, defensive spirals initiated too soon. The system did not need perfect information. It needed probability, and probability favored it more with every panicked adjustment the enemy made. What made this collapse so complete was that the enemy did not know what to counter. There was no visible new weapon, no dramatic change in aircraft silhouette, no obvious radar emissions they could identify and jam. From their perspective, the threat was invisible. Invisible threats are the hardest to fight because you cannot train against what you cannot define. Commanders on the enemy side began issuing contradictory guidance. Some urged aggression to reclaim initiative. Others advised caution to preserve aircraft and pilots. Mixed messages filtered down two squadrons already shaken by losses they could not explain. Discipline eroded. Trust in doctrine weakened. Meanwhile, pilots facing the system began to exploit the hesitation they sensed. They pressed attacks more confidently, knowing the enemy was slower to commit. They maneuvered with intention rather than desperation. The psychological balance had flipped. The enemy still had capable aircraft and skilled pilots, but they no longer had certainty, and certainty, once lost, rarely returns quickly. This is the moment many historians overlook. They focused on the 4 aircraft destroyed in 1 minute. They count wrecks and confirmed kills, but the real damage happened afterward. It happened in the minds of pilots who survived and carried that uncertainty into every mission that followed. The targeting system didn't just win an engagement. It rewired the enemy's decision-making process. What almost no one realized at the time was that the most dangerous part of the system was not its sophistication, but how simple it was once understood. It didn't rely on overwhelming firepower or exotic materials. It relied on something far more disruptive in warfare. A different way of seeing the battlefield. The technology itself had been dismissed because it didn't look revolutionary. There were no dramatic new weapons attached to it, no obvious increase in speed or armor. On paper, it appeared incremental, a refinement, an aid, something that might help under ideal conditions but collapse under stress. That assumption blinded nearly everyone to its real value. The system's true innovation was integration. Instead of treating sensors, targeting, and weapons as separate steps that required human mediation, it compressed them into a continuous loop. Detection flowed directly into prediction. Prediction flowed directly into engagement. The pilot was no longer stitching those steps together under pressure. The system did it instantly, every second, without fatigue. This is why it worked so well against experienced pilots. Veteran pilots are dangerous because they recognize patterns faster than novices. They know when an opponent is about to turn, climb, or disengage. But that strength becomes a weakness when the enemy can recognize those same patterns faster and without emotional bias. The system did not care that a maneuver had worked 100 times before. It only cared whether it would work this time, and usually it would not. What truly shocked analysts later was how little training was required once pilots accepted the system's logic. The learning curve was psychological, not technical. Pilots had to unlearn the instinct to wait until they could see the enemy clearly. They had to trust information that arrived before visual confirmation. Once they crossed that mental barrier, their effectiveness increased dramatically. This created a quiet divide. Pilots who embraced the system began to outperform their peers consistently, not because they were better pilots, but because they were operating with more time, more information, more certainty. Others resisted, clinging to traditional methods, convinced that reliance on automation would dull their edge. Ironically, it was that resistance that made them slower. Meanwhile, enemy intelligence units struggled to explain what they were facing. They examined the wreckage, reviewed gun camera footage, analyzed the engagement geometry. Nothing pointed to a new weapon. Nothing explained the speed of target acquisition. From their perspective, pilots were being engaged before they were even fully aware they were vulnerable. This led to dangerous conclusions. Some enemy commanders assumed there was a hidden ace, pilot responsible for the losses. Others suspected a breakthrough in training. A few theorized electronic warfare, jamming, or deception. Resources were diverted chasing ghosts, while the real advantage remained quietly operational, improving with every mission. The system did not dominate because it was perfect. It dominated because it was invisible. It didn't announce itself. It didn't demand attention. It simply worked. And in war, what works tends to spread faster than what is officially approved. By the time higher command began to understand what was happening, the system was already shaping engagements beyond that original minute. The 4 aircraft shot down were no longer the headline. They were the proof of concept. The real story was how a dismissed idea became a force multiplier that no one could easily counter. And that raises an unsettling question. If a relatively simple shift in perception and integration could change air combat this dramatically, how many other laughable ideas were being ignored at that very moment? Adaptation did come, but it arrived unevenly and too late. Once reports accumulated and patterns could no longer be dismissed as coincidence, the enemy began searching for ways to neutralize what they still couldn't clearly see. Orders went out to vary approach angles, stagger formations, and avoid predictable attack runs. On paper, these countermeasures looked sound. In practice, they introduced new problems that compounded existing ones. Pilots were now asked to fly against their instincts. Variability replaced rhythm. Improvisation replaced drilled response. That sounds flexible, even smart, but flexibility without a clear framework creates hesitation. Each pilot began solving the fight alone, interpreting vague guidance in real time while traveling at hundreds of miles per hour. Coordination suffered. Mutual support weakened. The very cohesion that once protected formations began to dissolve. Some units attempted technological counters. They experimented with sensor masking, altered emission profiles, and aggressive maneuvering designed to overload targeting calculations. What they didn't understand was that the system didn't require pristine data. It was designed to operate in noise. Imperfect inputs were expected. The math compensated. Erratic behavior, instead of confusing it, often made outcomes easier to predict because panic follows patterns of its own. The most telling adaptation attempt was psychological. Enemy instructors began telling pilots not to trust their instruments, to rely instead on visual confirmation and intuition. It was a reaction born of fear, not logic. By rejecting instruments, pilots slowed their own decision-making even further, widening the very gap the system exploited. What they framed as independence became isolation. Each cockpit became its own battlefield, disconnected from a shared understanding of the fight. Meanwhile, on the other side, something equally important was happening. Operators and pilots using the system were learning its limits. They discovered when it was strongest and when it required restraint. They learned to anticipate enemy adaptation before it fully manifested. The system was not static. Software adjustments, parameter tuning, and procedural refinements quietly improved performance. Each mission made the next one more lethal. But this learning curve wasn't without cost. There were close calls, moments when overconfidence nearly led to disaster. Instances where pilots followed system cues too aggressively and entered situations that required human judgment to escape. Those incidents reinforced a critical lesson. Dominance came not from blind trust, but from partnership. The most effective crews treated the system as a collaborator, not an authority. That balance widened the gap further. While one side was still arguing about whether the system should exist at all, the other side was refining how to use it under pressure. By the time formal countermeasures were proposed, they were already outdated. The battlefield had moved on. What truly sealed the system's advantage was institutional inertia on the enemy's side. Changes in doctrine required consensus. Consensus required understanding. Understanding required admitting vulnerability. That admission never fully came. Instead, losses were attributed to individual error, bad luck, or isolated incidents. It was safer for couriers and morale to blame pilots than to accept that the nature of air combat had shifted. And so the adaptation stalled. This is how technological edges become decisive, not through instant superiority, but through asymmetric learning. One side evolves faster because it accepts reality sooner. The other hesitates, constrained by pride, tradition, and the fear of being wrong. By the time the enemy truly grasped what they were facing, the system was no longer new. It was embedded, normalized, quietly rewriting engagement outcomes mission after mission. The laughter was gone, replaced by caution, then avoidance, and finally resignation. If adaptation defines survival in war, then delay defines defeat inside their own command structure. The reaction was far from unified. The same event that shook the enemy created an entirely different kind of tension on the friendly side. Not fear of defeat, but fear of disruption. Because the system's success raised questions. No institution likes to answer quickly. Who deserves credit? Who takes responsibility? And what happens to the doctrines built by people still in charge? Some officers wanted immediate expansion. They argued that any system capable of collapsing an enemy formation in 60 seconds should be deployed everywhere without delay. Others urged caution. They warned that relying too heavily on a system not fully understood could create new vulnerabilities. A few quietly questioned whether the results should even be emphasized at all. Those voices carried weight. Military organizations are not just fighting forces. They are hierarchical. Careers are built on doctrine, experience, and authority. A system that bypasses traditional skill hierarchies threatens more than the enemy. It threatens internal balance. Pilots who had spent years earning reputations as elite tacticians were suddenly competing with something that didn't care about reputation at all. That created resistance, subtle but real. Reports were soft. Language was carefully chosen. Instead of highlighting the system's role, documents emphasized pilot decision-making, favorable conditions, or enemy mistakes. The goal wasn't to deny what happened, but to dilute it, to prevent 1 minute in the sky from forcing a reckoning too soon. Meanwhile, the operators closest to the system knew the truth. They saw the engagement data. They watched how outcomes changed when the system was active versus when it wasn't. They noticed how enemy behavior shifted even when no shots were fired, but their voices carried less authority than tradition. This is where innovation often stalls, not because it fails, but because it works too well, too fast. Rapid success leaves no time for institutions to adapt gracefully. Instead of controlled change, there is disruption, and disruption creates enemies on both sides of the battlefield. Some units quietly kept using the system, refining it without fanfare. Others shelved it after initial trials, citing concerns about training burden or integration complexity. The result was uneven adoption. Where it was used consistently, results continued to improve. Where it was sidelined, engagements reverted to familiar patterns and familiar losses. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Eventually, higher command was forced to confront the data, not the anecdotes, not the opinions, but the numbers. Engagement durations shortened. Enemy breakoffs increased. Friendly losses declined. The system did not guarantee victory, but it tilted probabilities decisively. Still, public acknowledgement lagged. Official histories tend to favor clean narratives, heroic pilots, clear tactics. Linear progress, a system that operated quietly in the background, undermining decades of established thinking, did not fit neatly into that mold. So it remained underplayed, its impact scattered across footnotes and technical appendices. Yet among those who flew with it, the verdict was already clear. They trusted it not because it was flawless, but because it gave them something precious in combat. Time, Chini 2, the CG time to maneuver. Time to survive. And once pilots experienced that advantage, they rarely give it up willingly. The system had crossed an invisible threshold. It no longer needed official endorsement to matter. It was already shaping behavior, altering tactics, and rewriting outcomes in ways that could not be undone. Long after the skies had quieted and the immediate pressure of combat faded, the influence of that targeting system continued to spread in ways few people could trace back to its origin, not through announcements or medals, but through subtle shifts in how future systems were designed, tested, and trusted. Engineers took notes. Analysts adjusted assumptions. Training manuals began to change their language, even if they never mentioned the original system by name. The most important change was conceptual. For the first time, air combat planners began designing around anticipation instead of reaction. Instead of asking how quickly a pilot could see and respond, they asked how early a system could recognize intent. That single shift altered everything. Radar, sensors, and computing were no longer support tools. They became central actors in the fight, shaping outcomes before human awareness fully caught up. New projects quietly adopted the same philosophy. Data fusion replaced isolated displays. Prediction models became more aggressive. Systems were built to think ahead, not just report the present. The logic was simple. Whoever controlled the future moment of the fight controlled the fight itself. That idea traced directly back to that single minute when 4 aircraft fell before anyone fully understood why. Pilots entering training years later never knew there had been a debate. They accepted integrated targeting as normal. They learned to trust cues that appeared before visual confirmation. What once felt unnatural became instinctive. The laughter that greeted the original system vanished, replaced by reliance so complete it was rarely questioned. Ironically, this normalization hid the system's revolutionary nature. When innovation becomes standard, its origin fades. Credits persistoris flatten. What remains is outcome, not cause. Future generations saw improved survivability, cleaner engagements, shorter fights. They did not see the skepticism, the resistance, or the narrow margin where the idea could have been abandoned entirely. On the strategic level, this shift forced adversaries to rethink air combat as well. Visual dominance was no longer enough. Maneuverability alone could not compensate for being anticipated. The emphasis moved toward electronic warfare, sensor denial, and deception. Air combat became less about who could turn tighter and more about who could hide intent longer. That transformation did not happen overnight, but it was irreversible. The system's true legacy was not measured in aircraft destroyed, but in how it changed what militaries believed was possible. It proved that superiority did not require more pilots, more aircraft, or more courage. It required better understanding of time, information, and decision-making under pressure. And that lesson extended beyond the air. Ground forces, naval planners, and intelligence agencies all absorbed variations of the same idea. Predictive systems began shaping operations across domains, quietly, consistently, without ceremony. The future of warfare tilted away from reaction and toward preemption, all because one system, once laughed at, worked when it mattered most. But there is a final layer to this story that almost never gets discussed. Not the technology, not the doctrine, the popolo. Because while systems evolve, the humans who took the risk to trust them often paid a price that history rarely records. The men who trusted the system were not immediately rewarded. In fact, for many of them, the opposite happened. Betting on an unproven technology in combat meant standing apart from peers, questioning authority, and accepting responsibility if anything went wrong. In war, failure is visible. Success, especially quiet success, often is not. Some pilots found their reputations complicated rather than enhanced. Their victories were real, but difficult to explain in familiar terms. Commanders preferred stories they could understand and repeat. Skill, courage, experience. A system in part of the thinking disrupted those narratives. A few pilots were subtly sidelined, their results attributed to favorable conditions rather than insight or judgment. Operators who advocated for the system faced similar resistance. They were seen as specialists, technicians, not warriors. Their role blurred the line between combatant and support, a distinction military culture had long enforced. When missions succeeded, credit flowed upward. When questions arose, scrutiny flowed downward. The psychological toll was real. Flying with the system meant living in a space between confidence and doubt. Pilots trusted it, but knew others questioned that trust. Every engagement carried an unspoken burden. If something failed, they would be blamed, not just for the loss, but for believing in the wrong thing. That pressure followed them long after the missions ended. There were also moral questions no one had prepared them for. The system compressed time so effectively that engagements sometimes ended before pilots fully processed what had happened. For aircraft destroyed in 1 minute was tactically impressive. Emotionally, it was unsettling. combat already moves fast. When it moves faster than human perception, the distance between action and consequence grows wider. Some pilots struggled with that distance. They replayed engagements in their minds, trying to reconcile decisions made in fractions of seconds with lives lost on the other side. Traditional dogfights carried a grim clarity. Eu saw the enemy. You reacted. You fired. The system introduced abstraction, calculations, probabilities. For some, that made survival easier. For others, it made reflection harder. And then there were those whose careers quietly ended. A few advocates pushed too hard, challenged the wrong people, asked the wrong questions at the wrong time. They were reassigned, rotated out, or simply faded from influential positions, not punished overtly, but removed from the conversation. Institutions rarely retaliate loudly. They just stop listening. Years later, when official histories were written, their names appeared rarely, if at all. The system was mentioned obliquely. The moment was condensed. The human cost of pushing change disappeared between paragraphs. Yet, without those individuals, the system would never have survived long enough to matter. They accepted uncertainty so others could inherit certainty. They absorbed doubts so later pilots could fly without it. That is the quiet price of innovation. In war, it is paid not only in risk, but in recognition withheld. And that brings us to the final question this story leaves behind. Not about technology or tactics, but about memory. Who decides which risks are remembered and which are quietly erased? By the time the war moved on and newer systems replaced older ones, the moment that changed everything had already been absorbed into routine. What was once radical became expected. What was once mocked became doctrine. And the minute when 4 aircraft fell from the sky in 60 seconds, quietly dissolved into statistics, charts, and revised manuals. This is how history often erases its turning points. There was no single plaque commemorating the system. No parade honoring the operators who trusted it when others laughed. No official doctrine update that clearly said, this is when air combat changed forever. Instead, the legacy was fragmented. A line in a technical report, a footnote in an after-action analysis, a design principle carried forward without explanation. Future pilots, trained on systems built from the same logic, never questioned their origins. They grew up trusting predictive displays, integrated targeting, and machine-assisted decisions as naturally as previous generations trusted their eyes. To them, it didn't feel like innovation. It felt like reality. And that is the final stage of any true transformation, when people forget there was ever another way. Yet, if you trace those systems backward, strip away the layers of refinement and institutional language, you always arrive at the same uncomfortable truth. Progress did not begin with consensus. It began with ridicule, with doubt, with a system everyone dismissed until the moment it performed under the only conditions that matter in war: chaos, pressure, and lethal consequences. That is the real lesson hidden inside this story. Not that technology always wins, or that machines replace humans, but that the future of warfare belongs to those willing to endure being wrong in public before being proven right in combat. The targeting system did not succeed because it was flawless. It succeeded because someone allowed it to exist long enough to face reality instead of theory. And once reality spoke, it spoke decisively. For aircraft in 1 minute was not an anomaly. It was a a glimpse of a battlefield where speed of understanding mattered more than speed of reaction, where anticipation defeated instinct, where laughter gave way to silence. That battlefield is now the standard. The uncomfortable question is not whether this change was inevitable. It is how many similar ideas never survive long enough to be tested, buried under tradition, pride, or fear of embarrassment. History remembers outcomes, not near victories, not aborted experiments, which means the next revolution may already exist, somewhere being laughed at right now. If you stayed until the very end, you already understand something most. People never stop to consider. The biggest shifts in warfare rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, laughed at, dismissed, ignored, until they work. And when they do, the world changes before anyone has time to argue about it. If this story made you rethink how air, combat, technology, and decision-making really evolve under pressure, leave a comment right now with the phrase, "1 minute changed everything." That tells me you followed the story all the way through. Make sure to like this video if you want more hidden military breakthroughs, forgotten innovations, and moments when a single decision rewrote the rules of war. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story appearing on your screen, because the next one dives even deeper into another idea that was mocked right before it changed history. Thanks for watching until the end. Now click on the next video and keep going.